So Ed Brown asked me to talk about a case of research informing policy, and in fact it informed quite a large transformation in one particular sector. This is a case study on mobile money and how research created it. Most people are aware of the M-Pesa system in Kenya, where you can transfer money from phone to phone and cash in, cash out through agents, not a bank. And it's grown from launch in 2007, I think it was, to something like 18 million users by now. So you'll see on your screens what looks like a mobile, and my colleague Nigel said that I mustn't draw attention to the fact that I created a mobile for a talk about mobile money. So the story starts, of course, one of the reasons I used a mobile was because there isn't a single line, a single storyline that leads through the whole thing. You cannot say that the whole of mobile money is attributed to one set of research. That's not true. There are loads of people who have got involved and who contributed to the flow of things. And so what I'm trying to illustrate is that whilst there are many threads, what I can talk about is one particular thread, and it was a particularly significant thread, and I think it is reasonable. There are people in this room who know of its contribution to the transformational action of mobile money. So let's start with the DFID-funded research. We're talking about back in 2001, 2002. This is when very few people in Africa own mobile phones. But DFID funded what I would call agnostic research. We didn't have a hypothesis that we were investigating. Rather, they asked the open question, how are people using mobile phones? How are mobile phones changing communication in Africa? And remember, this is back when sort of, 3, 4, 5% of people actually own phones. 2001, 2002. Now, study was in Ghana, Botswana and Uganda. And what we found was that there was very low ownership, but very high use. If you asked about ownership, you got low numbers. But if you asked, have you used a phone in the last 3 months? Then even in rural areas, you got 70 to 80% responses yes. And then of those, 45% who have said they've used a phone said they used it for remittances. This is phoning up Uncle George and saying that the school fees are due, and that please could you send some money. We also found in those 3 countries this phenomena of airtime swapping. People had spontaneously worked out, nothing to do with NGOs, donors, researchers, anything like that, but they had spontaneously worked out that they could buy airtime credit in, say, Nairobi and or in the capital, and then they could not put that airtime on their phone, but they could text the code to someone else, maybe their relative or maybe a merchant, and that person would put it on their phone, and if it was a merchant, they would then pass money to the relative of the person. So you had this phenomena where airtime had already become a sort of virtual currency. We also, just to follow through on the research thread, we were then commissioned to do a very similar study in Mozambique, India and Tanzania, and we found exactly the same thing. Very high use of the phone, not frequent use, but at least once in the last 3 months for 70 to 80% of the people, and most of it on the subject matter was remittances, and they had this airtime swapping phenomena. So we took that research and said, right, let's share it with people. And the first people we shared it with were the private sector in Mozambique, a group called Msel. And we told them about the airtime credit swapping. And the problem with the existing system was that once somebody put that credit on their phone, it could no longer be shared with anybody else. They had to use it. What Msel did was they introduced they were the first telecom to offer credit swapping, which basically meant if I have 10 minutes of airtime on my phone, I could share with you 5 minutes, and I can do that from my phone, sharing it to another phone. So they were enhancing the virtual currency type effect of this airtime swapping. That would be back in 2004 now we're talking. Yes, around 2003, 2004. So I just want to talk about another little thread that then informed this whole thing, and that is a literature survey on banking in Africa and remittances. It's really important to understand that at this time, less than 8% of Africans had a bank account. And therefore to send money from one person to another is difficult. And of course, Africa has multispatial households. The husband or the eldest son has often gone away to work somewhere else and is still actually supporting the core household and sending money home for school fees and stuff like that. So within a country, they weren't using bank accounts. They were actually putting money on a bus, putting it in an envelope and then sending the money. Or the alternative was to take 3 days off work so that you could travel home, give your family money and then come back to your work. So the alternatives were very flaky. And the barrier to opening bank accounts was this know your customer. Banking has lots of tight rules. I doubt anybody in the room will remember opening their first bank account, but you have to provide your physical address, you have to show utility bills to prove it, and those sorts of rules still apply even in Africa. And of course most people don't have a physical address, so it's very difficult for them to open a bank account. And that's not accounting for the fact that then when you want to try and get your money, you have to queue for 2 hours, and there's a huge inconvenience because there aren't many banks. At the time we launch M-Pesa, there are 430 banks and branches of banks in the whole country. There are now something like 30,000 agents where you can cash in and cash out to the M-Pesa system. The other thing was global remittances. At that time, about $120 billion was being sent from the global north to the global south, basically from developed countries to developing countries. However, the average transaction of that whole $120 billion was 12%. And that felt to us really iniquitous. And we hoped that the next steps that you see would actually change that. And I'm pleased to say it's down to about 8%. Although for Africa, it remains hovering around 12%. The problem is because, in fact, for Africa at that time, it was up in the 20-something%. If you wanted to send $100 through Western Union at that time, it was costing $23 to send it. Now, often banks have a fixed charge, so they charge £15 to make an international transaction. So if you send $10,000, then that's fine. That's only 0.15% of the transaction. But if you only send $100, then that's 15%. So it was the whole global transfer system is against small amounts of money. I should say that there's a gentleman, you were finding at that time a number of champions beginning to talk about remittances. And there's a chap called Dilip Ratha, who is a senior economist at the World Bank. and he was really championing that we should do something about remittances at that time, about 2001, 2002. And he's recently actually done a TED talk, and I would thoroughly recommend it. So the other thing that we did was begin to talk to donors. We found that the Inter-American Development Bank was already working on remittances in Latin America, the transfer from America downwards through Mexico, onwards to places like Guatemala. And we went to WSIS, which is all about information and communication technology. So the first person we spoke to were IDRC, a Canadian research outfit, which many in this room will know. And in fact, their response from a chap called Steve Song was to immediately offer money for a pilot. Problem was, we didn't know what to do with that money. It wasn't a question of piloting. It was a question of actually, sharing the research and getting people to respond to it appropriately, like the Mozambique Msel guys did. At DFID, the first person we approached was David Woolner, who's in this room, and we should all congratulate him on taking this serious. And in fact, we asked him not to offer us money, but to make introductions to other places. And so through him, we were able to work with the private sector, with Vodafone. There were also other streams like InfoDev. We were doing some work with InfoDev, shared with them the idea, and they had picked it up. And for a number of years, they have worked in the regulatory field, as have Cgap, and we talked to them as well. But the point was that David introduced us to Vodafone, and in particular to a champion called Nick Hughes, who at that time was in the corporate social responsibility. And just to put this in context, Vodafone had just failed to launch a mobile money proposition in Europe. They had made an alliance with a couple of other telephone companies, and they'd launched a product called SimPay. I think it was launched in 2003 and it closes in 2005. Because in Europe we have many other instruments to pay things, for things, and the whole idea of paying for things with the mobile phone didn't really take off. And they were also in the process of just negotiating a contract with DFID for what they presented as and how I interpret it, as a boring back office telecom support for bank branches in Kenya. So they were suggesting that they would just strengthen the data connections between branches of banks and head office. And DFID were very willing to listen and adjust the contract. And again, all credit should go to Doug Pierce, Justin Heisted and Chris Bold, who were all involved with that process. And of course, within Vodafone, it wasn't just Nick Hughes, but the Safaricom leader, Michael Joseph at that time. And there's a chap called Robert Gathu, who was the finance director at that time and doesn't get public credit, but really ought to. In fact, you can say, well, hang on, why have we only ever heard of M-Pesa through Vodafone? Why haven't we heard of this research thread? Well, because Vodafone has a good PR system, and as researchers, we don't necessarily have good PR system. But the research only led to or contributed, I should say, to the idea, and the researchers contributed to the various negotiations. And it was really Vodafone that did take it through and create the big win of M-Pesa in Kenya. And as I've already said, that was huge in that it was, it grew very, very quickly. Most of the growth curves are tremendously high. They went from very few inlets and outlets to something like 17,000 very quickly. I believe now something like 1/4 of the economy of Kenya goes through the M-Pesa system. They talk about 1.6 billion going through the system every month now. Yeah, the M-Pesa story has been written up, and it's recognized as a big win in transformational actions, because it has strengthened people's ability to live their livelihoods and to share their livelihoods. But it's important to remember that it wasn't the only one. There are also some losers. So there's a telephone company called Zain, a telecom company, who have since been bought out by Airtel. But at the same time, they also launched an equivalent of M-Pesa, and they got the price point wrong. It was too expensive, and basically M-Pesa gradually just became the place to go. Safaricom was already strong in Kenya, and I think the stronger than Zain, and I think the strength of the users of Safaricom plus the right price point was what made M-Pesa launch properly. But the research was shared with other people as well. So it was shared with Orange as part of their strategic consultation. And that led on to mobile money, which you mainly find in West Africa, but we're now finding is moving across Africa. It was shared with the ANZ Bank, and they started a product called Wing in Cambodia, which was an alternative model and very much focused on the remittance corridors, particularly through the garment factories. And Wing carries on in Cambodia, not in the numbers of M-Pesa, and that's why you hear so much about M-Pesa, but you don't hear so much about the others, but still in the hundreds of thousands. And bearing in mind that Cambodia only has 10 million people as opposed to Kenya's, I think it's 60 million. Yeah. Splash was private entrepreneurs who discussed the research and then went to Sierra Leone and started something. So there were lots of other models, and there are other models that had nothing to do with the research. So the MTN money down in South Africa had nothing to do with it, and Wizit had nothing to do with it, and yet those are all part of the mobile money ecosystem. However, it's not just about the technical product or the technical launch. There are other things that came out the research which led to its flow from research into policy. One of the things was we talked to various politicians. The key person was Stephen Timms, who at that time was in the Treasury and was second to Gordon Brown. I actually met him at an arts festival and gave him my elevator pitch, which was, that international remittances stand at 120 billion, and transaction costs are an average of 12%. Well, to put that in context, total aid is 60 billion. So the rich supporting the poor is 60 billion. The poor supporting the poor is 120, and that we should do something to lower that transaction cost. We talked to the State Department in the US through the Inter-American Development Bank and through meeting someone on a plane. Talked to people like a particular state regulator, Maryland financial regulator. We had some work with the Commission for Africa on the, and we were invited to present to them our findings. And of course, the Central Bank of Kenya, what happened was that Stephen Timms invited us to the Treasury to present the fuller story. And when we turned up, there was a whole team, and including the head of Financial Services Authority, the FSA, Dominic Peachy. And he went on to really help many central banks in Africa to understand the regulatory challenges of this new product called mobile phone-based money transfer, and enable them to find gaps. So M-Pesa was launched in Kenya not by changing the policy, but finding a space in the policy that allowed it and then getting a letter of no objection from the central bank. And we should credit, we become very Europe-centric in these stories. We must credit the Central Bank of Kenya, who took, and a politician called Amos Kimuna, who really took some serious decisions when the rest of the world had not experienced this mobile money. He took some risks and he allowed Safaricom to go ahead. There was also, in terms of this regulation, the Cgap picked up the mantle, and alongside DFID produced sort of a donor knowledge map and encouraged donors to continue to think about this. And we must credit the work of David Porteous on this. And they began a real steady lobbying for changes in regulations, and their blog is still the place to go if you want to understand the regulatory challenges of this new thing called mobile money. And we also talked to the Trade Association of the Mobile Network Operators, and they created a work stream which you can see on their site easily now, and has also led them to consider the mHealth, mAgri type work as well. Now, this was a new space, so unsurprisingly, a social network analysis showed that bankers went to banking conferences and telecoms went to telecom conferences, and those interested in microcredit went to microcredit conferences, and very little crossover. We literally found 3 people who had been to, out of something like 8,000 names, 3 people had actually moved from one type of conference to the other. So working with DFID, the IFC, Cgap and GSMA, they created a new conference called the Mobile Money Summit, and that's they only had to subsidize it the first year, and that's now an annual commercial conference, and that is the place to wheel and deal for new products and new designs within the mobile money ecosystem. And we specifically invited 1/3 bankers, 1/3 telecoms and 1/3 others in order to get them talking to each other. Now, the researchers also work with commercial people like Clarion Events and Informer, and they also have a thread now of mobile money conferences. And ATEC in particular has really picked up the idea that there needed to be new space, and they run African orientated conferences. So it's not just about lobbying specific people, but it's creating the space to talk about your research and to talk about new things. And of course that happens increasingly virtually nowadays. So the Cgap blog, I've said, is very important. Clarion Events started a linking group. That was all very important in the development of ideas and the ongoing development of ideas. You also need more research. So I talked about this this thread being contributed to by 2 specific studies commissioned by DFID, but actually we needed more. And so IDRC had links to Research ICT Africa and made appropriate introductions. And then Research ICT Africa do every 2 years a household survey of how people are using mobile phones in 13 countries in Africa. And what we were able to do was to get them to include questions on money transfer and banking, etc. So they brought the money side into the telecom studies, and then people like FinScope, who look at people's financial literacy, they started to think about the telecom side. So basically we're getting regular updates on the environment for introducing and taking this forward, introducing mobile money and taking it forward. And I talked about GSMA, and they created a work stream, and they also worked a lot in the end with international remittances. And so we had got to a point where Citibank were considering setting up a clearinghouse unfortunately in 2008, 2009, and many of you will know that recession hits. Citibank actually struggle, almost go bankrupt. GSMA continued to have a strong brokering role. Western Union, they're the most obvious partners for international mobile money. And they initially reject the idea with a sort of famous, no, this will never affect our business model. Some of you will know the old story that when the telegraph was first introduced and Western Union were running the Pony Express, there's a famous statement by a Western Union official who says, no, this telegraph will never affect our business model. Well, there's now a lesser famous saying by one of them in 2005, 2006, saying, no, this will never affect our business model. And then having to eat their words in 2007, 2008. MasterCard start getting into the mix. So there's some work on international remittances, basically held up by the recession, but you'll see that really moving forward in the next couple of years. And of course you need some publicity. So there's the Mobile Money Summit, but there's other conferences, a group called Balancing Act who really specialize in sharing information on information communication technology. They start talking about banking and payments through mobile phones. They write a book called M-Money. UNECA create a book called M-Banking, an African Financial Revolution. There are reports on the DFID website. I have to say that probably very low on the academic journal papers. Or it's all about actually getting the message out there to the private sector and donors rather than to other academics. And there's a very small thread where we were trying to get the public interested, but that was I happened to have a friend of a friend who was a friend of the Economist editor, and so you'll see one or two lead stories in the Economist about the possibilities of mobile money. DFID used to run a magazine called Development, which I really like, and I really wish they would bring it back. And even in-flight magazines, they're, having it on the plane, Kenya Airways plane, that was all very important. So all of those that's communicating how the research is disseminated and talked about. It's about specific meetings between people, and it's about creating a general atmosphere, but it's also about not defining it as a simple technical widget that needs to be introduced, but understanding the regulatory challenges behind it and talking to politicians and policy makers specifically about that. Just finally, as I have done some research over the last couple of years on how research flows into policy, I found a work by a chap called Stevens, who was actually a diplomat, and he said that there are 5 elements to really changing the environment, changing the agenda, and I can relate those back to the story now with hindsight. So actually, if you look at number 2, setting an agenda by reframing the way the issue is debated and creating pressure for change, that comes out of the desk studies on remittances and the individual research. So we were redefining the agenda and actually saying, look, remittances are important for development. And in fact, that's a message which through the State Department and the work of the Treasury got all the way into the Gleneagles G8 summit. I mean, it's a small point, but 15.15 subsection B says we need to lower transaction costs and use not mobiles, I think they frame it as use new technologies to lower the transaction costs and encourage remittances from the developed north to the developing south. Stephen's point number 3 is about building networks. and so that support the delivery of change. And I hope you can see that that's that whole creating the space to talk, creating the space virtually. You have developing the capacity within organizations to allow them to understand and respond to an issue, but also changing the institutions, for example, influencing strategy and resource allocations. Well, that's that whole M-Pesa with Vodafone, but also with Orange and mobile money, and with ANZ Bank in Cambodia. They changed the way they were going to implement their strategy. And then finally, Stevens actually says you have to change the perceptions and public opinion. I think in this story that wasn't necessarily true, but for completeness, then we can relate it back to the keeping the public interested. So that's the story. Sorry, it's a bit longer than anticipated, but that's how some research in 2001, 2002 contributed to the transformation of financial services in Africa.